back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined by Joshua Sullivan.
Yeah, hello.
And Matthew Van Milligan.
Hello.
Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
After Mass one Sunday,
Yeah.
a few weeks ago, was handed an article by a parishioner, and they said, would you be able to break this down on your podcast?
Yeah.
And so I took the article, I shared it with you guys, and it's from Mastermind Quotes. I mean, it's a website that sometimes talks about lifestyle things and entertainment stuff. It's not really a religious
No.
page, and I'm not sure how often they talk about religious topics. You know, there's a section of the website that has inspirational quotes and celebrity quotes, so that's fun.
Yeah.
But in this particular article by Joy Fadogba, there's an article that says 7 reasons boomers are leaving and ditching the church. So for those of you who don't know, Joy here, the author of this article, she describes boomers as people between the ages of 58 and 76. So by my rough math, that's 1949, born in 1949 till 1967.
So in that age group.
In that age group.
Gotcha.
So she's saying, here are the 7 reasons why boomers, those born from 1949 to 1967, are leaving and ditching the church. It says the church, but it
Doesn't actually make Catholic. I think it means Christianity maybe.
definitely Christianity,
because it talks about mega churches too.
Yeah, and yeah, because it says she makes comments here like many churches, or however, she does specifically mention the Catholic Church a number of times.
She does, yeah.
So maybe she's just talking about Christianity in general. Anyways, it's an interesting proposal she's putting together here on this, website.
If you look at your faith, like if you look outside your congregation, would you say that she's roughly correct?
I think that this age group, which is probably something that people would not agree with, but I would say that this age group is missing from the church, because people normally would say teenagers are missing from the church, or they generalize and say young people are missing from the church, right? So they generalize and say that, but really, from my experience, when you look at church pews, and I'm talking about the Catholic Church, you have a lot of people who are 75 plus.
Yeah.
Those people have been diehard Catholics all their life.
Yeah.
They come to Mass every weekend and sometimes
Possibly
during
every
the
day.
week.
Yeah.
And then you have people probably from 45 to 50 down.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of gap in age where the 50 to 75. What does she say again? Sorry,
It's pretty
58 to 76.
Yeah.
I would say that's pretty true, actually. That age group is missing from our churches.
And not that there isn't one or two faithful.
Oh no,
but
not
as a general,
not extinct from our churches.
Yeah.
But that age group in numbers
Yeah.
is missing from our churches, which is really interesting because people would probably on first thought disagree, but on second thought, when you think about it again, probably people would agree.
I think actually, if you're looking at it, that's part of the decline in the Catholic Church system itself. If those are the people that have left the church, they haven't left the church right now. They've left the church over the last couple of years. Or
Exactly, it makes sense,
right? And because of that, they probably didn't raise their kids Catholic, and because of that, their grandkids aren't Catholic, and so that would show the decline throughout the whole entire.
That's right.
From under 75 all the way down.
It's true, but it's funny because where we're seeing an uptick in the practice of the church is what people would probably disagree with. It would be the children or grandchildren of this age group that are starting to return in recent years to the faith.
It makes total sense to me, because I think what has happened is those individuals that might have, at that age group, might have taken their faith on a very specific type of level, and that would have meant that they didn't implant their children would have been cradle Catholics, or they were cradle Catholics, but weren't indoctrinated with the faith. And that's not maybe not the right word, but weren't taught the faith properly, or weren't taught the faith in its fullness.
Yeah.
And so those are the people that have an understanding of what they think the church teaches. And those are a lot in Northern Ontario, anyways. You meet a lot of those people who claim to be Catholic but never go to church, and so those are those types of people. You know what I mean? That claim that they understand what the Catholic Church teaches, but don't actually know what the Catholic Church teaches. And so their kids never would have when they have questions. What is the Eucharist? What is that kind of stuff? Their parents wouldn't know or wouldn't be able to tell them necessarily, and so that question was lost. So those people coming back to the church now, finding faith, finding a relationship with God, finding how much faith means to them, is because they're finding it on their own. They're not finding it from being a cradle Catholic per se, but that they were Catholic, and maybe those seeds of baptism and confirmation and the Eucharist and all the sacraments, those seeds that were planted are starting to grow now that they're adults, and they're looking for truth and they're looking for answers.
Yeah, if I could, just for humor's sake, if you could humor me for a sec, if you look at this 1949 to 1967 range, okay, so let's say someone born in 1949, like the author here of this article is suggesting, by the time their confirmation age, right? So that's 13.
Yep.
So it would be around
52?
1962.
62,
right?
yeah, okay.
The Catholic Church is embarking on this Vatican II,
Yep.
right? And there's this change starting to happen, right?
Yeah.
And teenagers are they're interested in other things and whatever it might be, and then so that's from the beginning. That's the earliest group from 1949. If you want to go to 1967, the latest group that this author is saying, by the time their confirmation age 13, it's 1980. And already you're seeing massive change within the church, both liturgically and sort of in the way that, sort of in the mentality of how the faith is expressed or taught, right?
Yeah.
So you have this wide gap of the coming of age of this age group is falling into an area where the church was sort of going in all sorts of directions.
Yeah.
Not to mention within that time period as well, society is changing too.
Yes.
You have things like the sexual revolution. You have things like that are just ongoing. Change in mentality, change in family life. You have sort of the whole hippie movement and all these sort of things happening in society, right? So that's the age group that she's saying is missing from the church. To me, there's both spiritual and cultural things happening in the time that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think if we're doing kind of factor analysis, that is like, yes, of course, there's a lot of kind of cultural instability. There's a lot of flux in kind of the church and kind of the practice of faith during like the formative years of this particular generation. And when you shared the article with me, it was like, okay, 7 reasons. Like I can probably guess 4 or 5 of them. It was like because it's because you can characterize any generation, and you'd be like, okay, each generation has their hangups. This isn't just kind of like let's
ditch on this.
Let's make fun of boomers. No, it's not like my generation has hangups, and there are obstacles for any generation to overcome. But I think one of those factors too is kind of the cultural shift that happened after World War II. That it's like how the economy was developed, how kind of commercialization and all of these things. If we go through kind of some of the reasons, a lot of the reasons or the given reasons why boomers have left or are leaving or ditching the church are, this is what I expect the church to be, and this is what I'm getting instead. The other thing you can kind of do some factor analysis and associate with that generation of people is that generation of people invented the term "the customer is always right." That it's like you have this kind of this service mentality of it's like that I'm showing up to church and it's an exchange. I'm putting money in the basket, so I'm expecting something in return.
Oh, good.
And we're talking about Catholicism, but you could identify this trend more broadly as well.
Amongst the whole.
Yeah, especially in churches where there is a lot of commodification of spiritual goods. That it's like Okay, I'm showing up, and I have a list, a checklist of if I'm not getting these things, I'm going somewhere else.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go through some of these reasons that the author is saying here. The number one reason she's saying is there's disagreements over social issues, and she says she's sort of making a comparison here between what she's characterizing as the church and characterizing as society. So she says, while in society we've progressed on LGBTQ rights and gender equality, racial justice. She says many churches have remained conservative.
I think, and who remain conservative haven't changed. But what you're talking about there is if this is the group that has been going through the revolution and the changes that are going, like as we talked about, going from the 70s and the 80s and 90s, then this makes sense that they're just keep expecting things to change with the times. But the church is remaining stagnant. Not stagnant in a bad way, because that sounds like negative, but is remaining solid, let's just say, and not changing at all. And so this makes sense to me that the church is staying the same, but that they would expect change because their whole life has been a change. It's not like when you're going back 100 years, 200 years, and you can go over a whole century and it's pretty much the same from within 100 years. In the last 100 years, things have changed so much.
And to the point where this generation would be conditioned to be suspicious of stasis or tradition or like stability in general, or just like continuity with the past, because again you have all that flux, but like kind of jumping forward a generation, the way you're saying that it's their kids and grandkids that are actually coming back to church and involved and have like a real faith that's like that they've seen where that road ends, or like that's my experience, that it's like my people of my parents' generation who've said the church just hasn't kept up. Like there's this idea that there should be this same progressive mentality within the church that they expect from their kind of political or other aspects of society. Turns out that progressive mentality didn't actually create a lot of progress, and it created a lot of instability in families, in society, and in other kind of public institutions. And it's the following generation that realizes, this was actually kind of a problem. So they crave that stability in family life. They crave, structure within their faith and within their worship. So it's interesting to see kind of the pendulum swing back a little bit.
And I would say on sort of these social issues that there are people who just don't want to know what the church teaches on these issues, right? I think that just from, it's just more of I believe that this is right? Because we're growing up with this sort of progressive mentality. And so it's like, well, because I believe it's right, the church should also do it.
We also talked about this with the just after Vatican II. Like this is the era that they're growing up, and after Vatican II, there's a lot of change, and sometimes those changes are directed by Vatican II. Sometimes those changes are going farther and way past what Vatican II actually is suggesting, because it's at the whim of the bishop or the priest of the area trying to make progressive changes. And so a lot of these changes aren't based in actual theology and teaching of the Catholic Church. And so they're used to these changes being at a specific whim and not being based in, like, so they don't go back to the church's teaching to say, why doesn't the church teach this? Or why isn't the church kept up with these changes in the time? They don't go with that, because when those changes are being introduced to them, there isn't that theology and backing necessarily, because we don't have it from Vatican II yet. We don't have written, like JP2 is not around yet, or Pope Benedict for that matter, or they don't have those changes written, or those changes are at a whim of a bishop or a priest or something, and because all the changes in Vatican II, the church hasn't caught up to correct those changes to bring them back to where they should be at. Does that make sense? And so I think sometimes that's part of it too, is that growing up through that.
I think this sort of age group is used to like how they grow up. It's like this. It's a time full of change. We're always adapting to change. We're always kind of pushing the envelope, right? So with that, I think that they generally feel like they're progressive, right? And they know what's best. And there's also this mentality in that era, the 50s, 60s, of rejecting authority.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. I know.
And so with that rejection of authority comes, well, like the Pope can't tell me what to do. You know, like the famous, I know this was in the 90s, but not in this age group, but, you know, the famous episode of, was it Sinead O'Connor when she ripped
yeah.
up the picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live?
Yeah.
And, you know, the outrage that came from it. And it was like, oh, Saturday Night Live got in trouble, and Sinead O'Connor was kind of, you know, pushed off to the side, canceled, if you will. And then, like, I mean, there's this movement that, like, this is what no one can tell me what to do. And you see that in people today. You see, like, well, I'm more spiritual and not religious, as if to say that the church is not the way for me to maintain my spiritual life. I'm going to maintain, what it all comes down to is I can maintain my spiritual life on my own.
And I don't
That's
need
why
the church.
things like, you know, all these things that where you center yourself are so popular today. I don't do any of them, but I'm just gonna like yoga or Tai Chi. I don't know what you know. That's why these things are popular, because it's like one with yourself and like all these things. That's what's popular today. You're in charge. Like, we don't need to be subjected to some rules of God, right? Like, we've made ourselves God, and this is sort of like where this is coming from, this sort of generation that's rejecting authority. So today you have a bunch of people saying, like, I don't need to go to church to have faith. Right. And then but you also see them making the same, like, opposite arguments when it comes to things like death, where it's like, well, we're all going to heaven. Well, like, heaven is a Christian belief. Heaven is a Christian belief. Heaven belongs to Jesus Christ, the one that you don't need to worship here on this earth because you're spiritual. Like, the one that you don't have to listen to because you're spiritual, not religious. Because listening to Jesus is like religious. I'm spiritual, right? So we pick and choose which parts of
Buffet,
we pick and choose what we want to believe. But this, like, rejection of all that, it has come down to, when it comes to social issues, well, it's like, well, why not? You know, like LGBT rights, as this author puts. Like, you know, the Catholic Church really values human rights. Human rights for all people. And Jesus
Not
Christ
specific
teaches
groups.
dignity in all people. That God has given each single person dignity. You know, we don't talk about, you know, we don't talk about other groups' rights. We talk about every single person has the right to be loved, the right to have dignity, the right to have justice, the right, like, all those things, right? But in today's world, it's like, well, particular groups need particular attention. And so some people find that in opposition of what the church says. But I don't think anyone actually gives any focus on what the church actually teaches. Right? So there's this like, always people finding themselves at odds with the church. She says boomers are more likely to be liberal leaning, right? And she characterizes the church as, you know, evil conservatives. You know, every time you use that word, firmly conservative, it's like you're bad for being conservative. Well, you know, what I don't think people understand about the Catholic Church is that we do what Jesus told us to.
For 2,000 years.
And it's worked for us for 2,000 years. You know, and you see these social issues that come in fluctuation with the time. You know, like, and just think about 5 years ago today, what was really important in our world. It's not the same as today. Think about 10 years ago what the social issues were, 20 years ago what the social issue. So you're right. Like, people aren't seeing them as leading us to anywhere better. But for some reason, some people are just not at the point of saying, well, maybe the church has it right. Anyways, let's move on, because there's, other, I'm not going to talk about all of them because I don't think they all apply to think. I mean, she's saying that there's an inability to connect with youth focused services, like churches that cater today to younger contemporary audiences, but, putting up big screens and having rock bands. I don't think that's the case in many Catholic churches. I think
Not the case.
You know what I mean?
There is the change of change in general sometimes, but that's not necessarily, I'm going to say, between a certain age group. That's just change with a specific generation, if that makes sense. So sometimes the younger generation doesn't like change, or sometimes the older generation doesn't like change. So like if we put it should be done in the books, but we're putting it up on a projector, that could be a specific complaint. But I don't think that has to do with anything with specifically people in this generation gap. I mean, the boomers.
and no doubt that there's been change,
Of course.
from 1949 until today. It's just
and the music has changed, right? And the
like
music.
we have microphones in church now.
Yes,
or
yeah.
we,
Yeah. I think the Catholic Church is a little more immune to this criticism than
Exactly.
than
The
other
Protestant
denominations.
Church,
So like
that makes sense.
when you're at to the point where you can't distinguish between a rock concert and
Yeah.
then you're like, okay, well I'm having a hard time seeing this as feeding my faith or feeding.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but again, thanks to the stability of and consistency of liturgy and the connection to tradition and whatever, like that's
Catholic Church doesn't
you may
suffer.
have technological upgrades.
Yeah.
But that's not just an innavigable system of change. Yeah.
So she also says science versus religion. She says that people in the boomers in this age group, they rely. I'll just read what she says. They feel science has largely made religious teachings obsolete, which doesn't make sense to me whatsoever.
No, but that's because, that is something that people, and we did a whole podcast on this. So you go back and look up science versus religion and whether they can coexist. We've realized that science and religion are both the same because they're both given to us by God, and so they are actually in unison. They're in relationship together, and so science can never contradict religion. And religion never contradicts science. And the cool part about this is we discovered this specifically in their age generation growing up. We discovered DNA. So we now know that the church has taught from that life begins at conception. And while science was saying we don't know, we now have proof through DNA that this is at conception is when a new life begins. Yeah. You know what I mean? The problem here is that even though science backs up religion now, we don't have the laws changing or the ideals changing. Now we change it to something different. Well, if the woman feels like aborting the baby, like that whole idea. Yeah. So sometimes religion and science seem at odds, but in reality, science and religion can't be at odds when we get down to the brass tacks of it, because they're both given to us through God.
Yeah, and not only are they not opposite modes of inquiry, they're mutually complementary modes of inquiry. Which I think, again, talking about kind of the generational difference, I think our generation has an easier time with that than previous generations, because I think one of the maybe disadvantages of modernism is like the lack of availability of information. You have again just different. You don't have access to all the kind of encyclicals that we do. You don't have if you're interested in a topic, you can't just go right down there. And like representative maybe of this particular generation is this idea of God in the gaps. So like there again, you have a kind of a reductionist view of history that like the development of scientific knowledge is that you want to give causal explanations to things. So it's like, okay, well, why does this apple fall to the earth? It's like, well, it has impetus. It's part of its nature, like in kind of old school natural philosophy, and God did it. So just like that's tacked on to every natural force, like, and God did it. But as a scientific knowledge increases, our explanatory power of the natural world increases. There's a view of that kind of shrinks out the role of God in the world, and so that there's like this competitive nature. And I think this generation, I think, is much more disposed to accept that false dichotomy, or to accept that kind of contradictory nature of the relationship between faith and science and faith and reason, and religion and science. Whereas, future generations be like, okay, you can recognize, no, it's actually problematic to look at those in competition. And, now we have access to a lot more information of what science used to look like
Yeah.
than just kind of this, caricature of it.
I think it's important to say too that this is not everybody in this generation, obviously, as we're talking about.
Absolutely.
But also, like what we're doing is responding to an article, and she's suggesting that this is what people are doing, and we're responding to that. So if people are feeling that they're in that generation, they're not quite understanding or not, and I agree with you, like that's not necessarily to you, but this is like the overall. If this is truth that she's speaking here, then we're trying to figure out why, or give an explanation, break it open, if you will.
And on that note, like what you were saying there, Matt, she also, like, another point she makes is that people are looking for more intellectual engagement and growing dissatisfied with the simplistic surface level teachings they receive at church. And, as a pastor, I would, vehemently disagree with her.
Yeah, I would too, especially in
To
the
say,
Catholic faith. Like,
and that goes along with what you're saying about, and God did it, right? Like, and I have heard from people in this age group, when we went to school, we didn't have our questions answered.
Yeah.
Like when we answered questions about why, why does the church teach this, or how, questions about Adam and Eve or Noah's Ark or all this stuff. It's like, well, they got in trouble for asking the question, or,
and there's some things that weren't proper to talk about in public, or whatever the case may be too, depending on what the topic is.
And the reason you go to church in the first place is because my parents told me. Like, our generation is much more comfortable with questioning those things without feeling threatened.
Interesting. Yeah. Because and because, like you're suggesting, these people are coming back to the church, they're doing it of their own free will, versus maybe a generation that their parents made them go, and so when they had questions, but then they got in trouble. So then it's just like, what's the point?
Yeah, and
that's a good question.
Like,
Yeah,
people who are craving intellectual discourse, I mean, our church is full of intellectual discourse, and perhaps there are so many resources out there that help people read the scriptures. There are so many writings of the saints, but also, like, I just think of Pope Benedict XVI, just because I'm reading some stuff right now. Like, throughout his whole career as a priest and bishop and cardinal, has written so many beautiful theological discourse about the Catholic Church. Also, like, think about the philosophy that comes from the tradition of the Catholic Church.
That's what I was thinking,
Like, all these things. So to say that we present a simplistic, surface level teaching at church. Now, it might be that, they're hearing a 4 or 5 minute homily from a priest who maybe is keeping it at the surface level, or someone who just didn't answer questions of people, right? But that's I wouldn't say that that's a problem widespread in the Catholic Church. And I even though I'm thinking about it from a Catholic perspective, I doubt that it's there from a Protestant perspective too, because some Protestant churches, like, the pastor that week, that's basically his job. Apologies to simplify the job, but it is to prepare this 1 hour sermon
to bring
and
people
usually
deep.
with quotes from the scriptures and quotes from whatever. Like, so to present something that's simple, I just don't see that as true. Now, I don't see that as true today. Perhaps 10, 20 years ago when they left the church, or 30 years ago when they left the church, maybe that was the case. But if people are looking for intellectual discourse, the church is full of ethical, philosophical, scriptural, theological, like, everything is just full of that discourse.
Yeah, I think that is relevant, though. If you're going 20, 30 years ago, if that's when they left the church, you and I, if we want more intellectual stimulation than we're getting, in our immediate community,
We can go deeper.
we can
Internet allows us that connection.
We have access to a lot more of the intellectual tradition of the church now
if you go
than
20
your
years
typical
ago,
churchgoer would.
Agreed, 100%.
30,
That's a
30
good
years
call.
ago. Yeah.
Another reason she says here is hypocritical behavior. She says, leaders of the church, they've grown disillusioned with leaders and members of the church, and I see this. That's probably the biggest complaint people have, is that the church is full of hypocrites. And I don't know. My response to that is, well, the church is a group of sinners trying to live out and achieve our salvation.
We're a hospital where everyone in the church is wounded. And Jesus is the only doctor, right? And this is not one of those, hey, let us bring you there. Like, it's wounded leading. There's the blind leading the blind. It's the wounded leading the wounded to the source of healing. That's what this church is. That means our pastors. That means our priests, our bishops. They're all people that have dealt with sin or are dealing with it, but they are the ones that are dedicating their lives to try to help lead others closer to that. And so there are going to be scandal. There are going to be some things like that when the human aspect of things, and when individuals fall away or lose their calling to lead others to the healer, and they either try to take on that healing themselves and or they lose it altogether and use it for a different purpose. I think I can see that it happens. I can see that, but I can see specifically that you have to understand what the church is.
Yeah, and her last point here about, we already talked about people who are more spiritual than religious. I think overall, if people have turned away from the church, I do see a growing. I see this growing affinity towards this "do what you want" sort of thing, as long as you don't hurt anyone, right? So there's this attitude about, I can go to church when I feel like it, but I don't have to go all the time. And because I don't go all the time, I don't lose my identity as a Catholic, right? I'm still a card-carrying member of the Catholic Church. And so when I do need the church in my life, I
Can show up.
I can show up, but I'm owed the services of the Catholic Church, right? And I can speak freely how I want. I don't have to believe everything the church says. I can think outside the box and make up my own conclusions. I can believe what I want. I can encourage people to believe what they want. I can have different opinion. I can disagree with the Pope. I can disagree with the church. Like, all these, I can receive the sacraments when I want and how I want. Like, there is this growing attitude that
I don't think this
that
is just
comes
just to that age group either. That's like
absolutely.
It's growing.
I think it's just like an attitude that people have who've left the church.
Yeah, for sure, 100%.
Who've left the regular practice of the faith.
Yeah.
And I think we're missing the mark. Like, God wants us to be part of his family. God wants us to be part of a regular gathering of the family. That, like, when you look at the commandments, I don't know anyone who's been worse off by following the commandments. And, like, to honor God first, to make the Sabbath holy, all these things that I've never heard of someone being made worse off. And I think people, either by a figure in the church, a member of their family, someone, some idea, whatever it might be, have been turned away from the church for whatever reason. And it's not the right reason. I think people need to just step back and think about why I left the church, why I left the practice of my faith. Is it valid? Are there things that I can allow my heart to be open to? Are there things that I can allow the Lord to really help? Is there someone I can talk to discuss those things? Oftentimes people who leave the church leave for reasons that aren't because of God.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're doing our family members a disservice. We're doing our children, our grandchildren a disservice by staying away from the church, because this is where we're healed. This is where we find God's grace. This is where we find the sacraments. This is how God communicates to us. And so I think it's really beneficial for people, whether they've left the church for these reasons, whatever age group that they're in, whether they've left the church for other reasons, whatever it might be. God is always calling us back, because Jesus Christ gave his life. Like, Jesus is the groom and the church is the bride. Jesus gave his life for the bride, right? He died for us, the church. And he wants us to be one. He wants us to be united together. So I invite people, if you've been away from the church, to consider speaking to someone to come back. If you know people who have been away from the church who have these disagreements, maybe you can encourage them to come back to the church, because God is always inviting us back. And I truly believe, especially in this world where there's so many ideas out there, there's so many complications out there, there's so many things going on in the world that pull our attention away from God, that the Catholic Church has the answers that people are looking for to help find this peace and this joy within their heart. And so I invite people to that. And that's all we're going to talk about today. But I truly believe that. And I truly believe that God is doing good things through his church. And even the hardest of hearts can be healed through the church. So let's think of someone this week. Let's pray for someone maybe that's been away from the church. Let's invite them back. Let's at least pray that their heart is open. And or if you're listening today and you've been away from the church for whatever reason or the other, let's not let that reason be the reason we cut ourselves off from the beautiful grace that God wants to give you. If you have any comments, you can drop us a line at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com or drop a line on our social media pages. That's all the time we have today. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.